Tonight, discover the shocking truth about royal families that historians rarely discuss. For centuries, European royalty practiced inbreeding so extreme, it created physical deformities, mental instability, and ultimately destroyed entire dynasties. The Habsburg jaw. Hemophilia spreading through royal bloodlines. Marriages between uncles and nieces that changed the fate of nations. Welcome to Whisper Hollow, where history's most fascinating secrets become your pathway to peaceful sleep. I'm here to guide you through the quiet drama of royal bloodlines, where keeping power in the family came at a devastating cost. As you settle into comfort, we'll explore how centuries of dynastic marriages created fragile alliances, rewrote the borders of Europe, and led to some of the strangest chapters in royal history. Close your eyes and let these whispered tales of power and consequence carry you gently toward rest. Our story begins in the grand palaces of Europe, where one family's obsession with purity would shape the continent for generations. What if I told you the map of modern Europe wasn't drawn by treaties or battles, but by a single family so obsessed with power that they literally married themselves into extinction? It sounds like something out of a dark fairy tale. Kings and queens, curses and twisted genetics. But it's the absolute shocking truth. For centuries, Europe's royals thought inbreeding was the secret to keeping their bloodline pure and their grip on the continent secure. It was a political strategy, a way to hoard power, land and wealth within the tightest circle possible. But for one family, the most powerful dynasty Europe had ever seen, this strategy wouldn't just fail, it would unleash a genetic catastrophe. This genetic time bomb would eventually produce a king so physically and mentally broken that his very existence paralyzed a global empire. His body was a prison of inherited deformities, his mind a total fog. And when he finally died without a single child to take his place, his death plunged the entire continent into a brutal decade-long war, a war that would topple empires, forge new superpowers, and permanently redraw the map of the world. This is the story of the House of Habsburg, and how their obsession with keeping power in the family didn't just destroy their dynasty, it changed everything. Before they became a warning about the dangers of inbreeding, the House of Habsburg was the gold standard for success. Their story doesn't start with massive armies or ancient fortunes. It starts in a small castle in modern-day Switzerland, where they were just minor counts with barely any influence. So how did they go from provincial nobles to rulers of a global empire? They built it all on a single brilliant principle, one immortalized in their family motto, belligerant alliés, 2 Felix Austria, nube, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. And they weren't kidding. This was their blueprint for an empire. While other kingdoms were bleeding themselves dry on the battlefield, the Habsburgs were playing the long game in the marriage bed. The master of this strategy was Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor in the late 15th century. He was a genius at political matchmaking. He secured the incredibly rich Duchy of Burgundy and the prosperous Low Countries not with an army, but by marrying its heiress, Mary of Burgundy. But that was just the start. The real masterstroke came with his kids. He arranged for his son, Philip the Handsome, to marry Joanna, the daughter of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Yep, the same rulers who had just unified Spain and paid for Columbus's trip to the New World. With a single marriage contract, the Habsburgs had linked their Austrian lands to the phenomenally wealthy Spanish Empire and its new territories in the Americas. The son of that union, Charles V, inherited everything. He became the most powerful man in Europe, a ruler who could honestly say that the sun never set on his empire. His lands stretched from Vienna to Peru, from Naples to Mexico City. It was an empire on a scale nobody had ever seen, and it was all cobbled together with wedding vows instead of swords. In the early days, the strategy was a massive success. Marrying into other royal families was how everyone played the game back then. It was how you sealed alliances, ended wars, and got new land without a fight. The Habsburgs were just better at it than anybody else. They knew a good marriage could win them more than any battle ever could. But here was the problem. How do you hold a sprawling, disconnected empire like that together? These lands were separated by geography, language, and culture. The Spanish in Madrid and the Austrians in Vienna had almost nothing in common except for the family that ruled them. For the Habsburgs, the answer seemed simple. If marrying outsiders brought land into the family, then marrying inside the family would keep it there. It was a logical, almost mathematical solution. They wanted to consolidate, to stop their hard-won lands from ever getting split up or lost through a foreign marriage. So they turned their brilliant strategy inward, creating a closed loop of power by marrying themselves, generation after generation. It was a move born of cold political pragmatism, but it set them on a collision course with biology itself, a path that would lead not to security, but to ruin. Section 2. The turn inward and the genetic trap. The man who built this empire, Charles V, knew it was too big for one person to handle. When he abdicated in 1556, he made a decision that would change everything. He split the family business. He gave his brother Ferdinand the ancestral Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He gave his son Philip II the much bigger prize, Spain, the Netherlands, his Italian lands, and the enormous colonial empire in the Americas. The House of Habsburg was now split into two main branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. This created a new problem. The two branches had to stay in a rock-solid alliance to protect themselves from their rivals, especially France, which was now completely surrounded by Habsburg territory. And what's the best way to make an alliance unbreakable? You bind it together with marriage. If the Spanish Habsburgs needed a queen, they looked to Vienna. If the Austrian Habsburgs needed a queen, they looked to Madrid. Suddenly, the only acceptable marriage partner for a Spanish Habsburg was another Habsburg. And so, it began. The gene pool, which was already more of a puddle, shrank dramatically. First cousins started marrying first cousins. Then, to really tighten the knot, uncles began marrying their own nieces. For a commoner, this would have been unthinkable, forbidden. For the Habsburgs, it became state policy. From a purely political angle, it was brilliant. An uncle-niece marriage creates a child who is 100% Habsburg. No diluting the sacred bloodline. No foreign influence. The family's lands and titles stayed perfectly, hermetically sealed. But what was politically brilliant was a biological disaster. You don't need a PhD in genetics to get why. Think of our genes as a massive deck of cards with the instructions for building a person. Most cards are good, but a few are flawed. These are recessive genes. A recessive gene is only a problem if you get two copies of it, one from each parent. If you just get one, the good gene from the other parent covers for it, and you're fine. For most people, the deck of cards is huge. The chance of two strangers who both carry the same rare, flawed card having a kid is incredibly low. But the Habsburgs weren't drawing from the massive deck of humanity. They were drawing from a tiny, marked deck labeled Habsburg only. Generation after generation, they kept shuffling the same small set of genes. The odds of two people with the same flawed gene getting married went through the roof. It became practically inevitable. The dynasty was playing genetic Russian roulette. With every single interfamily marriage, they were pulling the trigger again, loading another chamber with a potential disaster. The warning signs were there if you looked. Infant mortality in the family was sky high, even for the time. Queens suffered through heartbreaking cycles of stillbirths, miscarriages, and children who died within a few years. Of the 11 marriages made by the Spanish Habsburgs from the mid-16th century on, 9 were between close blood relatives. This was a deliberate policy of inbreeding, on a scale rarely seen in human history. They were building a dynasty on a foundation of genetic sand, and the cracks were starting to show. The fallout from all this didn't happen overnight. It built up, generation by generation, like a slow-moving poison in the family's veins. The most obvious and most famous sign of this decay was a facial deformity, so linked to the family it was named after them, the Habsburg jaw. Medically, it's called mandibular prognathism. It meant the lower jaw grew so long it jutted out way past the upper jaw. This usually came with a fleshy lower lip and a huge tongue, which made it incredibly hard to speak clearly or even chew food. Royal portraits, which are supposed to make you look powerful, instead became, well, clinical records of a genetic crisis. They show kings and queens who couldn't even close their mouths, their faces locked in a permanent, grim expression. The Habsburg jaw wasn't a mark of pride. It was a hereditary curse, a physical sign of their tainted bloodline that they wore for all the world to see. But the genetic rot went much deeper than looks. Let's just follow the line of Spanish kings. Philip II, the son of first cousins, was a capable and deeply religious ruler who oversaw Spain's golden age. But the shadows were already gathering in his own family. His first son and heir, Don Carlos, was a tragedy. Physically deformed and mentally unstable, he was known for fits of rage and truly bizarre behavior. His story is complicated, but his instability was a dark sign of things to come. He was eventually imprisoned by his own father and died under mysterious circumstances. Philip II's successor was his son Philip III, who was the product of an uncle-niece marriage. Philip III was nothing like his workaholic father. He was famous for his pious lethargy and a total lack of interest in actually governing, which he happily handed off to his buddies at court. Under his rule, the mighty Spanish Empire began to stall, bogged down by corruption and neglect. The family's energy was fading. The decline picked up speed under his son, Philip IV, who was also the product of a first-cousin marriage. He was a smart guy and a great patron of the arts. The painter Diego Velázquez made his court famous, but he oversaw a period of humiliating military defeats and economic collapse. Spain's grip on Europe was slipping, and in his own life he would seal the dynasty's fate. Desperate for a male heir after his first son died, Philip IV made the most fateful marriage in the family's history. He married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. The political math as always came first. Mariana was a Habsburg from the Austrian side, and the marriage would lock in the critical alliance between Madrid and Vienna. But the genetic bill for this union would be astronomical. Philip IV and Mariana of Austria weren't just uncle and niece. Their family tree is a tangled mess of interconnections. They shared so many recent ancestors that their genetic relationship was far closer than a typical uncle-niece pair. They had 8 pregnancies together. Only 2 of those children survived to adulthood. Several were miscarriages or stillbirths. One daughter, Margarita Teresa, the little princess in Velázquez's famous painting Las Meninas, survived, but she too had the family jaw. The other survivor was a son, a boy born so frail, so sick, so profoundly afflicted, that the courts of Europe whispered he wasn't a person, but a punishment. His name was Charles, and he was the final product of 2 centuries of genetic misadventure. He was the bomb that had been ticking at the heart of the Habsburg dynasty, and he was about to go off. Charles II of Spain was less a king, and more a collection of symptoms. He was the living, breathing embodiment of the Habsburgs' genetic collapse. The family's obsession with blood purity had reached its tragic endpoint in his broken body. His inbreeding coefficient, a scientific measure of how related your parents are, was a jaw-dropping 0.254. For context, the number for a child born to a brother and sister is 0.25. Genetically speaking, Charles was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. He was a human dead end. From the moment he was born in 1661, it was obvious something was deeply wrong. He was a weak, sick baby, and almost no one expected him to survive. He suffered from constant digestive problems. The physical deformities of his ancestors were cranked up to a grotesque level in him. The Habsburg jaw was so severe that his top and bottom teeth couldn't meet. He couldn't chew his food, so it would often just dribble out of his mouth, a detail foreign ambassadors noted with grim fascination. His tongue was so big it filled his mouth, making his speech thick, slurred, and nearly impossible to understand. His development was painfully slow. He couldn't walk until he was almost 8. He remained illiterate for most of his life, his brain simply unable to process it. By all accounts, he had the mind of a young child. He was prone to tantrums, deep depression, and moments of baffling innocence. The people of Spain, looking at their broken king, couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that this was the result of royal marriage policy. So they looked for a supernatural answer. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They believed he was the victim of a curse, a belief Charles himself sometimes shared, which led to horrifying exorcisms being performed right there in the royal palace. The political reality was even scarier than any curse. This man was the absolute ruler of a global empire. Spain still controlled southern Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, the Philippines, and a massive chunk of the Americas, from which it was pulling immense silver wealth. And on the throne sat a man who couldn't make a single coherent decision. His reign was just one long power vacuum. The government was run by a revolving door of schemers, his powerful mother, his successive wives and ambitious nobles, all fighting for influence over the helpless king. But the one question that obsessed every court in Europe was succession. Charles was the last male of the Spanish Habsburg line. The future of an entire empire rested on him having a kid. He was married twice, but both marriages were childless. It's almost certain that Charles was impotent, just one more casualty of his myriad genetic disorders. For over 30 years, the great powers of Europe just watched and waited. They treated the Spanish Empire like a dying man's estate, already drafting treaties to carve up its vast lands after his death. The French Bourbons, led by the Sun King, Louis XIV, had a strong claim. The Austrian Habsburgs, led by Emperor Leopold I, had an equally strong claim. Both sides moved their chess pieces into position, getting ready for the inevitable war. The fate of millions, the entire balance of power on the continent, all hinged on the final, fluttering heartbeat of one tragically broken man in Madrid. When Charles II finally died in 1700, his autopsy report served as a grim epitaph for his dynasty. Contemporary accounts claimed his body, quote, did not contain a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and that his head was full of water. And in his will, he lit the fuse that would set Europe on fire. In his last moments, in pain and totally confused, Charles II was pressured into making one final decision. Desperate to keep the Spanish Empire from being torn apart, his advisors convinced him to name a single, powerful heir. Ignoring his Austrian family, his will named Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his successor to the entire Spanish kingdom. Philip was the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. The logic was simple: only a power as great as France could possibly hold the Spanish inheritance together. When the news hit the French court at Versailles, Louis XIV supposedly declared, "The Pyrenees are no more." He imagined a future where France and Spain, two of Europe's greatest kingdoms, would be united under his Bourbon family, creating a Catholic superpower that would dominate everything. This was a future the rest of Europe could not and would not allow. For England, the Netherlands, and the Austrian Habsburgs, the idea of a Franco-Spanish juggernaut was a nightmare. The balance of power, the delicate system that stopped any one nation from getting too strong, would be completely destroyed. The Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, was furious. He had a direct blood claim and expected his own son to get the throne. He immediately started preparing for war. In London and The Hague, leaders saw a future where France controlled the trade of the Americas and the markets of Europe. They weren't going to stand for it either. In 1701, the Grand Alliance was formed, putting Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire against France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession was on. And this wasn't some minor royal squabble, it was one of the first real world wars. The conflict raged for over a decade, with huge battles fought in Spain, Italy, Germany, the Low Countries, and at sea. It was even fought in North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War. Let's be clear, the link between the Habsburgs' family planning and this continent-wide inferno is direct and undeniable. This war wasn't caused by a border dispute or a religious fight, it was caused by a biological failure. The Habsburg dynasty had systematically bred itself into extinction. Their centuries-long obsession with keeping power in the bloodline had created a power vacuum so huge it dragged every major European country into a vortex of violence. Tens of thousands died on bloody battlefields, all because a king in Madrid had been born genetically incapable of having a child. The very strategy designed to preserve the Habsburg legacy had instead burned it to the ground, and taken half of Europe with it. After more than a decade of brutal war, the exhausted nations of Europe finally came to the negotiating table. The treaties signed in 1713 and 1714, most famously the Treaty of Utrecht, officially ended the War of the Spanish Succession. And when the ink was dry, the map of Europe had been completely redrawn. First, Spain's fate was sealed. Charles II's will was sort of upheld. Philip of Anjou became King Philip V of Spain, which started the Bourbon dynasty's rule over the country, a dynasty that's still there today. But there was a huge catch. Philip had to renounce any claim to the throne of France for himself and his descendants, forever. The crowns of France and Spain would always be separate. The nightmare of a Bourbon superstate was avoided. Second, the vast Spanish Empire was carved up. The Habsburg obsession with keeping their lands together had failed in the most spectacular way possible. The Austrian branch of the family, even though they lost the Spanish crown, got a huge consolation prize. They received most of Spain's European territories, the Spanish Netherlands, which is now Belgium, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. The Austrian Habsburgs were now the top power in Italy, but the biggest winner of the war was probably Great Britain. The treaty gave them strategic naval bases that would secure their control of the seas for the next 200 years. They got Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain, giving them the keys to the Mediterranean. They also won the Asiento de Negros, a monopoly contract to supply African slaves to the Spanish colonies, which poured incredible wealth into the British economy. The war weakened France, crippled Spain, and set Great Britain on the path to becoming the world's #1 commercial and imperial power. But this war did more than just swap territories. It introduced a new guiding principle to European politics: the balance of power. The entire war had been fought to stop one nation from becoming too dominant, and the peace treaty was designed to keep it that way. For the next 2 centuries, right up until World War I, this idea would run European diplomacy, with nations constantly making and breaking alliances to check the ambition of any single power. The inbreeding of the Habsburgs, a private family affair driven by pride, had massive public consequences. It led straight to the extinction of their Spanish line. That extinction created a power vacuum that started a world war. That war ended with a treaty that literally redrew the borders of Europe, shifted huge amounts of colonial and economic power, and created a whole new political order. The Habsburgs' genetic collapse didn't just end their reign in Spain, it reshuffled the entire European deck. If this story of how one family's fatal flaw blew up a continent fascinated you, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history's craziest turning points. We love uncovering the hidden stories that show how small personal decisions can have world-shattering consequences. Let us know in the comments. What other historical dynasties do you think were brought down by their own fatal flaws? And while you're at it, check out our video on the fall of the Romanovs, another royal family brought to the brink by a secret genetic curse. The irony at the heart of the Habsburg story is just staggering. Their famous motto celebrated their unique path to power: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was a strategy meant to build and preserve an empire in peace. But by turning that strategy inward, by chasing blood purity like it was a religion, they corrupted the very thing that made them successful. Their obsession with the marriage bed led them straight to the battlefield. They tried to create a dynasty so perfect, so pure, and so secure that it would last forever. Instead, they carefully, deliberately, engineered their own extinction. And in the dynasty's final, gasping breath, as their last king died without an heir, they plunged a continent into chaos and accidentally gave birth to the modern map of Europe. The very tools they used to hoard power, blood, and inheritance became the agents of their spectacular, world-changing downfall.